Dizzy, she looked at me with eyes that said more than words ever could and whispered, "Tell me this doesn't mean something to you too." The rain fell in gentle, irregular drops, tapping a soft rhythm against the cafe window. The scent of damp earth mixed with warm coffee and the low hum of conversation created a quiet cocoon around me. I had come here to escape the noise of my own thoughts, to find a corner where the world felt smaller, quieter, safer. That was when I noticed her. She was standing near the bookshelf, idly flipping through a worn novel. At first glance, she seemed calm and collected. An air of quiet confidence radiated from her every movement. Yet there was something tender about the way she paused on a page, fingers lingering on the spine, as if searching not for words, but for meaning. She was beautiful, yes, but not in a way that demanded attention. Her grace was understated. Age reflected subtly in the gentle lines at the corner of her eyes, the soft, knowing curve of her smile. She carried herself like someone who had lived fully and learned quietly, someone who could see the world with clear, unsentimental eyes, yet still allow small joys to touch her. Our eyes met for the briefest of seconds, a flicker that made my chest tighten in a way I wasn't expecting. Her gaze wasn't merely casual curiosity. It felt like recognition, like a question unspoken. My hand, which had been resting idly on my coffee cup, twitched slightly. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words lodged. Something about that small gesture made her seem both approachable and untouchable at once, a paradox I couldn't ignore. I found myself scanning the space between us, noticing everything. The way the rain slid down the glass, the warmth radiating from her presence, the subtle rhythm of her breathing. Even the accidental brush of her hand against a book she was about to pick up made my pulse jump. It was as though the universe had arranged this moment to be noticed, small, almost invisible cues aligning in a way that demanded attention. Then she smiled, just a brief, knowing smile that didn't reach her lips fully, but it reached her eyes. And in that smile, there was an invitation, a silent acknowledgement that whatever this fleeting connection was, it mattered. My mind raced, debating whether to approach or retreat into the safety of solitude. I stayed, though, rooted in the chair, savoring the strange tension of proximity. There was no conversation yet, no words exchanged, and perhaps that was what made the moment so powerful. The quiet recognition between us, two strangers with an inexplicable pull, set the stage for something I couldn't yet name. The rain continued to fall, but inside that small cafe, a warmth was forming, subtle but undeniable. And in that warmth, I felt the first stirrings of something I knew would change the way I understood connection, closeness, and perhaps even love. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, blurring the world outside the cafe into muted shapes of umbrellas and wet streets. Inside, the warmth and aroma of coffee created a gentle cocoon. She was sitting at a small table near the window, a book open in front of her, fingers tracing the lines of the pages with absent-minded care. I gathered the courage to approach, letting the edge of my voice break the silence. "Excuse me, do you come here often?" The question felt awkward in my mouth, ordinary, yet when it reached her, her lips curved into a small, almost amused smile. She looked up from the book, her eyes scanning me with an easy curiosity that wasn't intimidating but inviting. "I do," she said, voice soft, warm, and confident, "though I spend more time with the books than the people." Her smile deepened as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and I noticed the delicate grace in that gesture, the subtle way she carried herself, poised yet unpretentious. I laughed softly, a little embarrassed by the nervous energy in my own movements. I can relate. Sometimes the world outside feels too loud. Her eyes met mine again, lingering just long enough to make my chest tighten. There was a moment of stillness where words seemed almost unnecessary. The cafe's hum, the drizzle against the glass, and the quiet rhythm of our breathing filled the space between us. We began to talk, first about the book she was holding, a classic, worn at the edges, one I had read and loved as well. Her insights surprised me. Thoughtful, nuanced, and somehow seasoned by life experience. It wasn't just the content she spoke about, but the way she shared it, each word deliberate yet easy, inviting me into her world without demanding anything in return. I found myself leaning slightly closer, drawn in by the warmth of her presence, the soft lilt of her voice, and the subtle movements of her hands as they rested on the table. Each gesture, each fleeting smile, seemed to carry unspoken meaning. When I handed her a napkin to wipe a stray drop of condensation from her cup, our fingers brushed lightly. It was a fleeting touch, innocent yet electric, lingering in a way that neither of us could ignore. As our conversation unfolded, the awkwardness melted, replaced by a quiet connection I hadn't expected to find. We spoke of small things, the weather, the changing seasons, but beneath the casual words, there was an undercurrent of something deeper. Recognition, curiosity, and the tentative. A week had passed since our first conversation, and yet I found myself thinking about her often, how she had listened, really listened, to the smallest of my observations, and how her quiet presence lingered in my mind. I never realized how much a painting could feel like a memory, she said softly, almost to herself. Her voice carried a hint of melancholy that made me stop in my tracks. I glanced at her, noticing the slight quiver in her fingers as she adjusted the frame with careful attention. For a moment, I wanted to turn away, thinking perhaps I had no right to intrude, and yet something compelled me forward. Sometimes the smallest things remind us of the past we didn't realize we were carrying, I replied. Her head turned slowly, meeting my eyes, and I saw a flicker of something that made my chest tighten, a vulnerability she rarely let anyone see. She hesitated, as if weighing whether to continue, and then, almost imperceptibly, she shared a small story, a quiet regret from her past, something deeply personal but not dramatic, just honest. I listened, the world shrinking to the space between us. Her voice was steady but carried the weight of emotion, and I realized that this was the moment that demanded sincerity in return. Without thinking, I reached out, brushing my hand lightly against her arm. The touch was fleeting but deliberate, grounding us both. Her eyes softened, and she didn't pull away. In fact, she allowed the contact, letting it linger just enough to acknowledge the unspoken support I was offering. The warmth of her skin against mine was subtle but undeniable, and I felt a quiet reassurance settle over me. This wasn't about romance yet. It was about recognition, about two people seeing each other's humanity and allowing themselves to be seen in return. For a long while, we simply stood there, close enough that the edges of our arms touched, our breaths mingling in the small gallery space. There were no words for the tension that hummed between us, no need for declarations. Just the acknowledgement that something meaningful had begun, carried not in dramatic gestures, but in quiet understanding, gentle touches, and the courage to be vulnerable together. When she finally looked up and met my gaze fully, there was a softness there, a silent question that mirrored my own thoughts. It was the first real recognition that whatever this connection was, it wasn't fleeting. It mattered. And in that shared vulnerability, I realized we had both stepped into something neither of us could ignore, and neither of us wanted to. The late afternoon sun filtered through the half-drawn curtains, painting the small room in gold and amber. I had walked alongside her to a quiet little park, the kind where the paths wind unpredictably and the sound of traffic feels distant, almost imagined. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. And yet, amidst this ordinary calm, I couldn't shake the awareness of her presence beside me. We were silent for most of the walk, yet the quiet was not empty. There was a rhythm to our steps, subtle and unconscious, that mirrored a connection neither of us had yet named. Every so often, our shoulders brushed, innocent accidental touches, but each time a small spark of warmth traveled up my arm, settling somewhere deep in my chest. I caught her glancing at me once, her expression half curious, half guarded, as though testing the limits of our closeness. We reached a small fountain at the center of the park. Its waters rippled softly in the evening light, reflecting fleeting patterns on her face. She paused at the edge, resting her hand lightly on the stone, and I found myself standing closer than necessary, drawn by some invisible force. Our hands brushed again, this time deliberately, as she adjusted her scarf. The touch was brief, almost accidental, yet I felt a thrill at the pressure, subtle but electric, grounding us both in the moment. "Do you come here often?" I asked, keeping my voice light. She smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that made my chest tighten. "Sometimes," she replied. "It's peaceful." Her eyes lingered on mine, the faintest pause suggesting she saw more than I said, recognized the attention behind my glance. As we leaned over the edge of the fountain together to watch the water, our knees touched lightly. I could feel the warmth radiating through her coat, and the proximity made the small tension in my shoulders dissipate, replaced with a quiet awareness of closeness. She didn't pull away. In fact, she shifted slightly so that our arms brushed. That brush, subtle as it was, carried an intimacy neither of us voiced. It wasn't desire as much as it was recognition, the acknowledgement that our worlds were brushing together, and it felt right. We lingered there for what felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes. The park was quiet, the sky fading into a soft purple, and the world beyond seemed irrelevant. I noticed the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, how her cheek caught the dying light, how her hand moved in small, expressive gestures as she spoke softly about the painting we had seen earlier. Each detail etched itself into my mind, a tapestry of subtle cues that deepened my awareness of her presence. There was no rush, no urgency, just proximity, just the warmth of shared space. Every touch, every brush of clothing, every fleeting glance built a tension that was more emotional than physical. I realized, then, that the pull between us was growing, not through dramatic declarations, but in the simple act of being near each other, of allowing ourselves to occupy the same space without fear. By the time we left the park, the faint chill of evening had settled on the air, but a quiet warmth lingered between us, a promise that closeness had meaning, and that something deeper was quietly, inevitably beginning. The evening had settled softly around the city, and the streets glowed with the gentle hum of streetlights. She had invited me over to her apartment to share a quiet dinner. Not formal, just simple food, warm plates, and a table lit by a single lamp. There was a calm intimacy in the way she moved around her kitchen, pouring wine, arranging bowls of food, and laughing softly at the clumsy way I tried to help. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough to make me feel as though the world had narrowed to the space we occupied together. We sat opposite each other at the small table, the distance between us both literal and figurative. The soft, golden light highlighted the subtle lines of her face, the gentle curve of her cheekbones, and the warmth in her eyes that drew me in even as it made me hesitate. Conversation flowed easily at first, small talk about books, music, and the ordinary events of our week, but beneath the words there was a tension neither of us could quite name. It wasn't desire, not yet, but a quiet awareness of the space between us, a longing that lingered in glances and the almost imperceptible brush of hands. At one point, she paused mid-sentence, her gaze catching mine, and I noticed the way her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her napkin. The pause wasn't awkward. It was deliberate, as if she was weighing whether to speak the words that hovered just out of reach. I leaned forward slightly, sensing her hesitation, feeling the subtle warmth radiating from her presence. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the silence was charged, not with expectation, but with acknowledgement. Then she reached across the table, her hand brushing mine lightly as she adjusted the placement of a plate. The touch was fleeting but deliberate, grounding, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest, a quiet reassurance that she saw me as more than a casual companion. It was a small, intimate gesture, the kind that communicates trust and recognition without the need for words. I, I wasn't sure you'd feel the same, she said softly, almost hesitantly, and her eyes searched mine. There was vulnerability there, a fragile openness that made my own chest tighten. The words weren't dramatic, but they carried weight. The weight of feelings unspoken, of confessions held back not from fear, but from caution. I wanted to respond, to tell her everything I felt, but the words seemed inadequate. Instead, I reached out, lightly resting my hand over hers, feeling the warmth of her skin and the gentle pulse beneath. Her fingers twitched slightly at first, then relaxed, and in that simple, quiet touch, 1,000 unspoken words were shared. We didn't need to declare our feelings yet. The acknowledgement, the recognition, the shared vulnerability was enough. The rest of the evening passed in a comforting quiet, punctuated by laughter and soft conversation. The city outside moved on without notice, but inside that small apartment, time felt suspended. And in the lingering touches, the soft glances, and the subtle hesitations, I realized that we had both begun to navigate the delicate terrain of something real, something unspoken, and profoundly intimate. By the time I left, the tension hadn't resolved, but had deepened in a way that felt inevitable. For the first time, I understood that some confessions aren't spoken. They're felt, shared through proximity, trust, and the courage to be seen. The evening air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain from earlier in the day. We had taken a walk through the quiet streets, the city lights reflecting on wet pavement, the world around us softened by the subtle glow of street lamps. There was a quietness between us, different from before, not awkward, but charged with the weight of unspoken words. Each step felt deliberate, each glance meaningful, as though both of us were aware of the invisible thread pulling us closer. We found ourselves at a small park bench tucked beneath an old oak tree, its leaves rustling softly in the gentle breeze. She paused, looking up at the branches swaying above, and I noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders. The way she shifted her weight, the almost imperceptible bite of her lip, and the softness in her gaze told me something was on her mind, something she wanted to say, but hadn't yet found the courage to speak. "Do you ever," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "wonder if moments like this mean more than they seem?" Her words hung in the air, delicate and fragile, yet loaded with intention. I looked at her, noticing how the streetlight caught the highlights in her hair, the way her eyes glistened with a mix of vulnerability and anticipation. My chest tightened, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of us. She shifted closer, the subtle warmth of her arm brushing against mine, a touch so light it could have been accidental, yet deliberate enough to speak volumes. My hand itched to reach for hers, to close the distance fully, and when I did, she didn't pull away. Instead, she let our fingers touch, resting them gently together as though testing whether the connection was real. That simple contact, the warmth of her skin, the reassuring pressure of her hand, felt like the answer to all the unspoken questions that had lingered between us for weeks. Her gaze met mine fully, unwavering, and then she spoke the words I had been waiting to hear, though I hadn't known I was waiting for them. "Tell me this doesn't mean something to you too." The quiet strength in her voice, the gentle vulnerability in her eyes, cut through every hesitation I had held on to. Time seemed to stretch, and in that suspended moment, the tension we had been carrying, the hesitation, the fear of misunderstanding, the societal boundaries of our age difference, all dissolved into clarity. I felt the urge to speak, to reassure her, but words felt inadequate. Instead, I leaned slightly closer, letting my hand cover hers fully, feeling the warmth of our connection settle into something steady and undeniable. Her breath mingled with mine in the cool night air, and for the first time, it wasn't just proximity or curiosity. It was recognition. Recognition that what we felt would have been growing slowly, quietly, was real, mutual, and worth exploring. We sat there in silence for a long while, hands intertwined, hearts quietly acknowledging each other's presence. The city around us moved on without notice, but we were suspended in a moment of understanding, of surrender to the subtle, unspoken affection that had been building between us. And in that simple, perfect stillness, the turning point was complete. Hesitation had given way to recognition, curiosity to acceptance, and the fragile tension of weeks had blossomed into something undeniable and deeply, quietly intimate. The city night had settled around us like a velvet blanket, soft and quiet, yet alive with the distant hum of life. After the turning point, after the words that had broken through weeks of hesitation, "Tell me this doesn't mean something to you too," the tension between us had transformed. It no longer thrummed with uncertainty or fear. It had softened into warmth, a gentle glow that radiated from her presence as surely as it did from my own awareness of her. We walked slowly back toward her apartment, side by side, neither speaking immediately. The rhythm of our steps matched, as though our bodies had learned the harmony of each other's space. Each subtle brush of her arm against mine, each incidental touch of our hands as we passed a lamppost or a wet leaf on the pavement, felt charged but safe, comforting rather than urgent. I noticed the delicate way her hair caught the streetlight, the gentle curve of her smile when she looked up at me, and the quiet confidence in the way she carried herself. Even now, in a moment of vulnerability, she radiated grace. Inside her apartment, the warmth of the room wrapped around us, making the air itself feel intimate. She poured us each a cup of tea, the steam curling between us, carrying the scent of herbs and subtle sweetness. I set my hand near hers on the counter, almost accidentally, yet deliberately enough that she felt the gesture and didn't withdraw. Instead, she allowed the contact, and I felt a thrill, not the rush of desire, but the deep comfort of being accepted, seen, and wanted in a tender, meaningful way. We settled on the couch, sitting close enough that our legs brushed, close enough that the heat of proximity was a quiet reassurance. She leaned slightly against me, and I felt the gentle weight of her shoulder resting against mine. Her breath, steady and calm, brushed against my neck as I tilted my head slightly toward her, letting the intimacy of the moment wash over us. Her hand moved to rest on my arm, fingertips tracing a path that was light, intentional, and entirely affectionate. We didn't need words. Our connection had matured beyond the need for verbal affirmation. Still, she turned her head, looking directly into my eyes, and smiled. A slow, knowing smile that held laughter, relief, and quiet joy all at once. I mirrored it, feeling the same warmth spread through me. Slowly, almost instinctively, we leaned toward each other. Her cheek brushed mine, soft and reassuring, a delicate kiss that felt like a promise rather than a question. My hand moved to cradle the back of her head lightly, feeling the softness of her hair and the warmth of her skin. Time seemed to pause. The city outside continued its distant murmur, but inside that room, there was only us. The gentle sway of bodies leaning closer, the tender pressure of hands holding, the silent acknowledgement that what had grown between us over weeks of quiet glances, touches, and conversations was real, mutual, and beautiful. By the time the night had deepened, we were entwined in a quiet closeness, shoulders touching, hands intertwined, occasional laughter and whispered comments breaking the silence. The age difference no longer felt like a boundary. It was simply a part of the story that had led us here, to a place where warmth, respect, and affection could flourish naturally. And in that shared silence, in the lingering glances and gentle touches, the story found its resolution. A slow-burn connection fulfilled in a way that was tender, human, and enduring. A beginning that promised more, built on trust, vulnerability, and quiet, undeniable love.